Hey everyone, welcome back to class. Hope you all had a good little break. So the past 2 weeks, I let you prepare and take the first midterm. 2 weeks ago, I gave you all the um, study guide for the midterm, and all last week was just focusing on trying to complete the midterm. Try not to make it too hard for you all. So as long as you just watch lecture videos, review the PowerPoint presentations, and watch documentaries, it was pretty straightforward, right? Okay. And also 2 weeks ago, March 11th, I asked you all to submit your oral history consent form. A majority of you have already submitted it and have an interviewee, although there's only a few of your classmates that I'm still waiting on a consent form. The project is actually due in about 2 weeks, so April 3rd. So if you haven't found an interviewee yet, and if you haven't submitted your consent form, please reach out to me ASAP, and then we could set something up for you, okay? All right. So for today's class, we're going to review Vietnamese American history. But before I begin on today's lecture on Vietnamese American history, I want to define the term immigrants. So, immigrants are those who immigrate from one geographic location to another on a voluntary basis. So, it's usually one's or the family's choice to move, and they usually have a location in mind to where they want to move to. On the other hand, refugees are those who are forced out of their home country and they cannot move. Unlike immigrants who can move back to their home country, refugees usually cannot move back to their home country because they are usually afraid of being persecuted or the anticipation to be persecuted. And this is based on an individual or the family's race, their religion, their nationality, membership, based on their association with a political group or even a different type of social group. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how the term waves. We use the word waves. I've been using the word waves. So waves of immigrants coming in and out. So when you think about the term waves, you also think about the ocean, where the waves come into the beach, and they could also flow back into the ocean. So immigrants are like that. You could see that immigrants come in, but they can also go back to where they came from. Unfortunately, refugees can't do that. So continue on about um, Vietnamese American history. We do know that uh, the Vietnamese are one of the largest groups of refugees to come in, starting in the 1970s. Starting with, we're going to start off with their history um, with French colonialism, and the French colonized Vietnam since the late 1880s. So what Vietnam was referred to back then was French Indochina, which also included parts of Cambodia and Laos. And you can still see it in the Vietnamese culture, the influences of France, like in their foods. A lot of their foods have some French influences. There's various other lucrative colonial possessions in the Vietnamese culture or in Vietnam also. But today now there's not as much French presence in Vietnam. Now going back into the history, the French's justification to colonizing Vietnam and other countries was because it was believed that it was their responsibility to colonize and quote unquote develop and civilize these countries. It sounds very familiar to what we talked about, right? Talking about manifest destiny. Now, the French didn't only just colonize Vietnam, so they colonized different African countries and different Asian countries. And they believed it was their right to colonize and develop these different countries because they believe not in their minds that they weren't civilized. And not only did they want to develop and civilize these other countries, but they were actually looking for materials and cheap labor. So Vietnam had an abundance of rice and rubber, and it's what the French wanted. On top of that, they paid for Vietnamese labor, and they paid them very poorly and made them work for endless hours. But there was really no coherent colonial policy for the Vietnamese. It was just as long as the French ruled Vietnam, the French government was satisfied. They were happy. But although there was tons of corruption, it was mostly a lot of self-interest. What is best for me? And it was usually the French who just wanted everything for themselves. And the French leaders and governors were easily bribed. So whatever was good for them, they didn't care what was going on. So the leaders would be easily bribed through money or whatever materials to be given. And at this time, Vietnam, well, actually, French Indochina, I'm sorry, at this time, it was illegal to use the word Vietnam, even though the name Vietnam was given to the country in 1802 by the Viet people. But if the term Vietnam was used during at the time France colonized Vietnam, they were persecuted. And then the people working on the plantations were Vietnamese coolies. They would often be paid very cheap, be treated terribly, and they're basically slaves. But it was the only way for a lot of the Vietnamese people to survive. They had to work on the plantations to feed their families. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and jump into mid 20th century Vietnam. So at this point, France was still present in Vietnam. But by World War II, the Japanese came and overran Vietnam. And after the war, the Vietnamese wanted to take the opportunity and basically take back their government. So this was led by Ho Chi Minh at the time. And Ho Chi Minh was trying to, along with other nationalists, try to take back Vietnam for the Vietnamese people. But unfortunately, the French they announced that they wanted to reclaim North Vietnam, and what the French did was that they tried to offer the Vietnamese people their independence, but they can't do anything without the French's permission. So in order for them to do anything within their country, they always had to get the French's permission. So of course, the Vietnamese didn't want that. They wanted their own independence. They wanted to do their own thing. So the Vietnamese people refused. And the French, they didn't like that either. So they just declared war on Vietnam in 1946. So just a year after the end of World War II, there was another war that occurred between Vietnam and France. Now, though, France had a hard time fighting against Vietnamese guerrilla tactics. A lot of this was because fighting in the Vietnamese ground, there's a lot of forest, and the Vietnamese people knew the environment and not the French. So it was really hard for them to fight against the people in their hometown or their home turf. In addition to that, China also provided the Vietnamese with military help, and the French were massacred. Unfortunately, the war lasted for 5 years, but the Vietnamese people succeeded, and France finally surrendered in 1953. Sorry, not 5 years, it's 7 years. So after 7 years, Vietnam won the war against France. And then in April of 1954, the world's powers, so it was the UK, the United States and the world's power, strongest countries, they met in Geneva, and it was originally decided for Vietnam to be split into two, very similar to Korea. So it was they wanted to split Vietnam in two at the 17th parallel, with Ho Chi Minh controlling the north and Bao Dai in South Vietnam. Now there was supposed to be a supervised election to unite both sides, the north and south, in 1956, but that didn't happen, and the split became permanent, so it divided the country. Now, so in this image right here, this is the 17th parallel, and you can see here that the orange is where Ho Chi Minh controlled, while Bao Dai controlled the south. Now, Catholic nationalists such as Ngo Dinh Dien became leader of South Vietnam, and it was because they didn't want the spread of communism. So, going back with United States and Korea, they didn't want um, they don't want one Asian country to fall to communism, and then after that one country, neighboring countries will start to fall into communism. That is known also as the domino effect. But unfortunately, Diem was killed in a coup in 1963, along with his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu. And after that, many others came into succession, but it wasn't very long. They weren't in control for very long, and the communists saw each leader as a puppet of the United States. So each member that would come into power in South Vietnam was just another puppet for the United States to control. Just one person to listen to what the U.S. would just expect him to do. And then, unfortunately, President JFK, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated um, during this time, and Lyndon B. Johnson, he became president. Uh, Now, Lyndon B. Johnson called for a draft, and he wanted to send thousands of American U.S. troops to Vietnam. So he drafted up to 35,000 American troops in the United States every month. And this was in the year 1965. It was a huge thing happening in the United States. And Operation Starlight was just the very first many major offensive ground attacks in Vietnam. So this lasted for 6 days and diffused North Vietnamese troops, but the troops quickly would rebuild. And by 1967, 500,000 military troops would be stationed in Vietnam. Okay, so I just wanted to bring this image up. The Vietnam War was largely discussed. It's a lot of authors talked about the Vietnam War and the USS, how they were a part of the war. Okay, so I chose this right here by Otto Lirac and his book Operation Starlight: The Beginning of the Blood Debt in Vietnam, August 1965. Now the U.S. public knew about the Vietnam War, and then if you started hearing um, what the reasons to behind going to Vietnam, and how many people were being recruited for the Vietnam War. There was mass protests against the government for sending more military into Vietnam, because there were regular bombings in Vietnam caused by the United States, and the amount that the United States spent every year was $25 billion just on the war. And every day there would be up to 15,000 deaths in Vietnam, and about 100,000 would be injured. That's a lot of troops. And why are a lot of U.S. military troops dying? Why is the United States spending so much money? It was just too much. That's why there's so much protest going on. And now, there was a poll that was conducted in 1968, and it showed that only 35% of U.S. citizens supported the war in Vietnam, while 50% opposed the war. The rest of those, so the 15%, had no opinion. So a lot of people just didn't want to be in Vietnam because, of course, that was a lot of money being spent and a lot of casualties and injuries. Now, there's an organization known as Vietnam Veterans, and they spoke out about their experiences in Vietnam. A lot of those who would come back injured in the fields, and they would just talk about their experiences. And a lot of them were on wheelchairs or crutches. They'd be either they have lost a limb or they be critically injured. And they threw away their medals they've gotten when they came back to show how powerful a message to say that they did not want to be in Vietnam. They did not want a war to be the U.S. to be in war in Vietnam. Um, Now at this point, President Nixon took over, and he then started to pull military troops out of Vietnam. And by 1975, the Vietnam War ended. Now there was a after the war, there was something called Operation Baby Lift, and this is where President Gerald Ford he announced that a lot of the orphans in Vietnam would be evacuated from Saigon and be moved to either the United States or various countries. And there was over 3,300 orphans from just South Vietnam, and they were just transported overseas. 2,600 came to United States, while 700 came to European countries. But the thing is that not all the children were orphans. A lot of them were just given up by their families because they didn't want their children to stay in Vietnam or what was going to happen next. Remember, war just ended, and at this point, North Vietnam took over to South Vietnam, and they don't know what was the future of Vietnam. And so, a lot of the families in Vietnam had to willingly give up their children, and to the Americans here, or to whoever they can provide their children to have a better life. And there was flights that continued until the North Vietnamese made it possible or made it difficult for aircrafts to come in and out. So it was to the point where no one could leave the country anymore. And here's an image of it's a very famous image of 22 Gia Long Street, and this is an American helicopter. And what's happening here is all those the Vietnamese people here in this is Saigon. All the Vietnamese citizens there are trying to escape, trying to flee the country to go to across the border or to where they believe it was going to be safe. They tried to fit as many people into the helicopter, but it couldn't fit everyone, so there would be a lot of people left on top of this roof. So this helicopter would go back and forth on top of this building up until North Vietnam took over the whole city. And this was on April 29, a day before the fall of Saigon. Now, in 1975, on April 29, North Vietnam came to attack and try to conquer Saigon. But then by noon, April 30, North Vietnam took control of all important points of Saigon, and they finally raised the northern flag, renaming the city Ho Chi Minh City. It still is called Ho Chi Minh City today, but a lot of people still call it Saigon because of its communist influence. They still know a lot of the elderly Vietnamese people call it Saigon up to today too. Now, another operation called Frequent Wind was what evacuated most American civilians. So, just like in the image, Operation Frequent Wind was what brought anyone who was American off the border, and they evacuated them through via helicopter. Uh, Tens of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians were associated with the South regime were also evacuated. But unfortunately, the rest who were normal citizens were left behind. And so, just a few hundreds or the hundreds of Vietnamese were evacuated, and like these families here were associated with the Americans. Unfortunately, the rest who could not get on a helicopter had to find various different ways out of the country. We've we've a lot of us have seen this and heard about the Vietnamese boat people, and it's where they escape the country through a small boat or a large boat, and they try to cram as many people as they can. Um, and the highest volume of boat people came between 1978 and 1979, and the continuous amount of boat people will continue up until the 1990s, which is 20 years later, almost 20 years later. And roughly around 2 million Vietnamese refugees left Vietnam between 1975 and 1995. So it's both through boats, through trying to escape the border or cross the border of Vietnam to another neighboring country, or by helicopter. Yeah, so a lot of Vietnamese refugees cross to the neighboring country, but some of these countries could not accept the amount of refugees being entering into their country, because it increased the number of citizens in these cities. But other countries, they took in all the other refugees and cared for them, make sure they did well. They put them in through different camps, and a lot of other countries, um, even as far as the Philippines, um, made refugee camps for all the Vietnamese people and also the other countries who were escaping their country too. Now, surviving on in the sea in these boats was very difficult. So they didn't know how long they would be out in sea. There is a documentary called Bolinao 52 by Doug Nguyen. He talked about a boat with 110 passengers, and they went into sea, but after 37 days, only 52 of the 110 survived on that boat. And it was because a lot of them didn't have fresh water, and they were in the middle of the sea. They ran out of water, there was no food. And you guys should watch this. I'll put a link to it, but you don't have to watch it. But if you are interested in watching this, I could put the link in the um, on Wednesday's box, and you can watch it. But a lot of these refugees had to resort to cannibalism because there was no food. A lot of them died from starvation. Not only that, pirates came in and killed and even molested the women there on the boats. And then it wasn't until this boat made it to the shores of the Philippines near a city called Bolinao, and the Filipino people there took the surviving 52 and helped them out. Now I'm going to start off with the first wave of Vietnamese refugees that arrived in the United States. Now the characteristics of this group was they spoke English pretty fluently. A lot of them worked alongside with the Americans in Vietnam, so they were pretty good in English. Um, they also included high-ranking soldiers. Uh, Again, people who work with American personnel or in companies that were in Vietnam. A lot of them were ethnic Vietnamese who came to the United States to get an education, and individuals who had relatives in the United States already too. And then, but in 1975, approximately 130,000 Vietnamese left Vietnam, and a lot of them were very high skilled and well educated. They were very wealthy. They had close ties with Americans or the American governments. They had close ties to the Americans, being that they had friends here in the United States already. Usually, what would happen is that those um, ties they had would come to Vietnam, and they would work alongside them, and then they got connected when they were moving to the United States. This first group, a lot of them were Catholics, and they're very familiar with Western values because of um, their experiences with the Americans in Vietnam. And a lot of these uh, refugees came by plane. So not only did if they didn't leave Vietnam through plane, they entered through a different country, either a neighboring country, or they escaped to a European country, and they moved to the United States by plane. A lot of them came with their entire or even just a few of their immediate families. Now, the first wave also, a lot of them were airlifted by the U.S. governments, and their bases in different countries like the Philippines, the Wake Islands, and Guam. Again, just like the Bolinao 52, when they were found by the Filipinos, they stayed in refugee camps. Now, those who were in the refugee camps, since the United States was present in the Philippines still, they were airlifted to go on a plane and move to the United States by plane. So a lot of the refugees came to refugee centers in California, Arkansas, Florida, and Pennsylvania. And they would stay in these camps for up to 6 months to learn the U.S. Culture, the education, and just try to assimilate into the new society. So the four refugee centers and these states was Camp Pendleton in California, Fort Schaff in Arkansas, Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania, and England Air Force Base in Florida. So remember these four uh, refugee centers, okay? These four are gonna be in your next quiz, and it's also gonna be on your midterm too. Okay, so keep note of these four places. Um, Now, the first wave, um, the first wave of Vietnamese refugees, they experienced something similar to what the first four groups of Asian Americans I mentioned. So Americans didn't welcome the Vietnamese refugees. Only 30%, 36% nationally wanted the Vietnamese refugees to come in. And many of the first wave Vietnamese refugees were sponsored by Christian churches and other charitable organizations. So remember, in just 1 year, um, 130,000 Vietnamese um, refugees left Vietnam to various countries, and a large number of those ended up coming to the United States. And at this point, President Gerald Ford, he wanted to help out too, so he signed the Indochina Migration and Refugee Act of 1975, and this allowed for refugees a special type of status to come into the country, to the United States, and establish a resettlement program. In addition, a bill was amended in 1977 that was under sponsorship of Senator Edward Kennedy to permit refugees to a parolee status and become a permanent resident in the United States. And in order to prevent something known as ghettoism, by concentrating resettled Vietnamese in just one area. Refugees were dispersed throughout different areas in the country. So this was just to help out the Vietnamese population to um, help them develop in different areas in the country. And on top of that, they were given assistance too by the government. They had a refugee status. They were assisted by the U.S. government. But afterwards, a lot of Vietnamese refugees eventually moved to California and Texas. Now, the second wave of Vietnamese refugees that came to the U.S. Started in 1978 and lasted until the 1980s, mid 1980s. And by then, almost 2 million people fled uh, communist re education camps. And by 1979, Chinese invaded Vietnam. Now, this group of refugees swamped the neighboring Southeast Asian countries. So a lot of them moved to places like Cambodia and areas in Laos. And then they also moved towards Philippines, where there's also a large population of Vietnamese, and in Hong Kong. Now, these were known as countries of first asylum, and they will come at a rate of 2,000 to around up to 50,000 refugees a month. Now, the second wave of Vietnamese were a lot of ethnic Chinese, and it was because a lot of internal conflict between the Vietnamese government and the Chinese that were living in Vietnam. And a lot of the second wave Vietnamese left by boat. So this group, there was a larger group of boat people, but and a lot of them were not very familiar with the Western culture and values compared to the first wave. Now, um, the first a lot of these countries, the first asylum countries, were very overwhelmed by the number of refugees coming in. So they started to expel. They didn't want boat people or refugees from coming in. And so now President Jimmy Carter became the president. He ordered the Seventh Fleet to look for any boat people or boats that had the boat people in the South China Sea and bring them to the United States. And a lot of the boat people, they defied, death. They risked their lives to go to sea to find a better life. It was better to escape and die trying to save themselves than stay in Vietnam and be killed by the communists. Um, because the things that the communists would do were very inhumane. And so it was better for them to try and escape to survive. And it was an estimated of 45% of second wave Vietnamese refugees died in sea. Again, like the Bolina 52 group, a lot of pirates would find these boats and rob the people, kill them, and even sexually molest the women there on the boats. Um, Now, because the large number of refugees escaping Vietnam, the United States wanted to help out because they were in Vietnam. They wanted to help the people out. So there was a U.S. policy that regarded the first Vietnamese refugees to disperse them throughout the United States. So it was to help them out. But now the second and third were settlements that brought the Vietnamese to warmer climates along the west coast and the Gulf of Mexico. They were brought to these different areas. Now I just want to show the population of Vietnamese Americans in the United States now. So the top five cities in the United States, four out of five of them are here in California. The first being here in San Jose with 106,992. And this was as of 2017. The next is Garden Grove, California, with 52,894. Houston, Texas, then San Diego, California, and then Westminster, California. Again, so we could see here, starting in the 1980s, we see the population starting at 231,000, and it's exploded up to 2017 with 1.3 million, more than 1.3 million Vietnamese Americans here in the United States. Now, in after 1975, there was a huge increase of refugees, um, along Southeast Asian and Vietnamese refugees. It was because of Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. So I'm going to talk about that and two lectures on the line when I'm talking about Cambodia. And it was because there's a new guerrilla war occurring in the Cambodian countryside. And also there was a collapse of resistance to Pathet Lao and Laos. There was a collective Cambodia labor camp, and a lot of those survivors would enter Thailand and move to different neighboring countries too. And then approximately around 250,000 ethnic Chinese will move from Vietnam. Remember, like I mentioned a little bit about um, the internal issues happening along with the ethnic Chinese in Vietnam, and they would move back to China. And then by spring 1979, roughly around 60,000 boat people would leave monthly. Um, so again, I want to talk about the first asylum countries: Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, who then started to refuse refugees. But the Geneva Conference, another conference happened in 1979. The Western countries began to accept Southeast Asian refugees. One of them, of course, being the United States, and even other countries in Europe. And by 1992, 1 million refugees were living in the US. 750,000 were in various other countries, such as France, Canada, and Australia. And there was many other refugee camps in other countries. Um, Although there was limited success of harsh first asylum countries, there were policies intended to stop the flow of the Vietnamese refugees. But boat people didn't drop below 20,000 um, a year until 1992. It was because a lot of the Vietnamese refugees want to escape um, the country because of the communist rule. And then roughly around 100,000 or more. Now, it's just an estimate of 100,000 that drowned in the South China Sea. It's not confirmed because they're not for sure that this is the accurate number of people or refugees that drowned there. Now, there was a lot of acts and programs that assisted the Vietnamese refugees and other Southeast Asian groups. So there was something known as the Orderly Departure Program. And ODP, it allowed direct immigration of Vietnamese straight to the United States. It's not just the Vietnamese people, but various Asian ethnic groups too that were being forced out of their country. And also focused on Amerasians and re-education camp internees. So around 300,000 would immigrate through the ODP by 1992, and 161,400 would be reunified with their family because of reunification programs. 81,500 Amerasians and families would be moved as well, and then 61,000 former political prisoners. So those who were caught by the communists and who were in politics and were imprisoned in Vietnam were immigrated by the ODP. Now, the humanitarian operation, or HO, was a resettlement program for the Vietnamese who were, at one time, they were associated with American organizations that were in Vietnam prior to the Vietnam War. or they worked alongside with former South Vietnamese governments. And the Amerasian Homecoming Act, it allowed for children who were fathered by U.S. soldiers, so Amerasian children, to also come to the United States. And there were over 30,000 Amerasians and close direct family, Vietnamese family members were allowed to come to the United States as immigrants. This also qualified for a number of refugee services as language and job trainings too. And then Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act of 1975 provided, it was just a one-time funding assistance and resettling Vietnamese and other refugees from Southeast Asia, Indochina. Then in 1977, it was reauthorized again to continue temporary funding for all the refugees. So not only just once, but it provided more assistance. And these funds would come from various places, and it was a lot through welfare. Um, or not a lot from welfare. It was not just through welfare, but through special legislations. This was voted through Congress, and the special social welfare status of refugees um, was kind of blurred. So there wasn't really a status for um, refugees to be on social welfare. But because refugee assistance programs um, they came through the Department of Health and Human Services. So, Department of Health and Human Services provided a lot more assistance to the Vietnamese refugees and other Southeast Asian refugees. And then finally, the Comprehensive Plan of Action, the CPA, it was to reduce the number of refugees that seek asylum and 72 participating countries. They would just assist other countries as well to, since they were being overwhelmed by various refugees, they would help assist to find locations for refugees and countries that would be able to assist. For this coming week, please complete your weekly discussion form by next Monday. And then quiz number 2 will be open this week from March 21st until next Sunday. So this quiz will be on the Vietnamese American history lecture. Okay? All right, everyone. Talk to you next week.